Hi, folks. Dennis Allen with the Disciple Dilemma. Thanks for joining us today on a podcast, A Disciple in a War, a conversation with Professor Kateryna. We're not going to give you her last name for obvious reasons. This is a lady who has significant credentials talking about not only what's going on in Ukraine, but also in Russia, as well as how it connects to United States foreign policy and this interesting angle. What does it mean to be a disciple in a war? She's a fantastic believer. I've known Kateryna now for several years, and I've watched her work, and I enjoy listening to her as she analyzes and talks about this world and this worldview. Kateryna's credentials include several university appointments around Kyiv, as well as working in the United States Embassy. She has recommendations of ambassadors and senior politicians. She's well known, she's well understood, and highly respected. So this is going to be a great conversation as Raymond and I spend some time with her. So let's join Raymond and Dr. Kateryna as we talk about a disciple in a war. Kateryna, we are so honored and thrilled that you would be with us today on the Disciple Dilemma.
Thank you for having me.
And Raymond, as always, it's a joy to have you.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be on these podcasts with you, and I'm genuinely looking forward to this one. So thank you for having me. What would I, as a Christian in America that's comfortable, what is it that I should be doing?
Basically, some kind of, in spiritual ways, there is some kind of collective responsibility for this injustice and impunity to be taking place in the 21st century. So if I were to say what people who are not immediately affected by this war in a military or in a security way, whether they are affected in other ways, of course they are. And so if you think that because you are in the US, it does not affect you personally, then this is something you have to rethink.
I was reading Peter Zeihan. I'm sure you know of him. He's been documenting how worldwide impact will have because of Ukraine, because Ukraine's the fourth largest food producer and Russia's the largest food exporter. All of the sources of fertilizer are going to be significantly impacted. The destruction of Ukraine's cities and small towns means that they're not going to be able to produce food. They'll be importing food. So the price of food is going to go through the roof. It's just amazing how pervasive the impact's going to be. We tend to think of Ukraine as some small country that we can't even find on a map. So how could that possibly affect me comfortably in Chicago? But it's going to have a big impact globally and on our lives here in the United States.
Yes, in material way, in economic, political, but I'm also saying about, values, about ideas, about spiritual things, if you want, that obviously have gone very wrong if we are now in the situation when nothing can be really done to stop the atrocities.
Culturally, we've become a post-Christian in the last 20 years. So we no longer have a common set of values, even those who were not Christians when I was young.
Do you remember the book that they wanted us to read at ACA by Jonathan Haidt? It was called The Happiness Hypothesis. And in that book, he was talking about the world needs someone to be evil in order that we might truly loathe and despise and then hate others. How do you feel about Vladimir Putin? And how do you feel about the Russian people as a result of what's gone on with the invasion of Ukraine?
There is a justified anger, but there is also a challenge of hatred that would stay with us in peaceful lives. And but I think that we have to deal with things in order. You cannot really preach about overcoming hatred in the moment when everything is still ongoing, when people are still, being slaughtered. I think you have to deal with things, in some priority ways, like weep with those who are weeping, and be joyful with those who are joyful.
Kateryna, as we in the West watch the news clips and we try to understand what's going on, we lack the perspective that you have, both as a believer in Christ and as a professional scholar whose professional world and life has been in the relations of Russia, the US, and Ukraine. How do you think the West is missing it and misunderstanding it? What do you want to tell us as you get us started in this conversation?
I would start with the February 24th, 4 a.m., when I woke up to shelling sounds in the airport near Kiev. And I was at home in Kiev, Ukraine's capital. And both as professional, as a scholar, as a person, I was very much in denial that something like this could happen in 2022, up until it actually happened. And even today, the 37th day into this war, it still feels surreal that something like this, the scale of the war crimes, of atrocities, of devastation, of cities wiped out, can be really happening, that this is not a nightmare. And the only factor that leaves me without doubt that I have seen it with my own eyes. And my impression from how in political terminology, we say collective West, has been responding, especially NATO extraordinary meetings and concluding statements. It suggests to me that there is still quite a significant degree of denial of this new reality, where there is no alternative to confronting this evil. There is just no other way around. And there are still, in the way the Western, not all, but many actors responding to this war, some attempts or hopes that there would be an alternative to the direct confrontation, an alternative to the pushback that this evil is actually requiring. And this brings me to a broader thinking about how we humans tend to resist to reality when it is painful, when it is uncomfortable, and how we prefer to stay in our comfortable alternative reality, just up until there is no possibility to avoid it. And so my call to the Western people, politicians, and voters, Christians, would be: don't wait until you wake up to the shelling in your town or to someone knocking at your door. There are other ways to accept reality in a less traumatic and dramatic way.
So how do you think we got here so that policymakers really can't conceive that they're going to have to use dominant military force to push back on this bully?
Yes, this is a very good question, because this is exactly where we have been, I mean, the free world has been aiming to arrive 70 years after World War II. And the whole framework that has been set was never again. And the set of values declared were aimed to promote win-win solutions. And this was increasingly, this political thinking has been increasingly rational. And when you are looking at things rationally, of course, win-win is much better than even win-lose. And everybody understands that a hot war is a lose-lose framework. So this is why, because it was so irrational, to me it was also surreal, not so much because I am in any illusions about Putin, but rather because it's just so insane. Especially if you think about his declared rationale that Ukraine is a hostile neighbor and we want it to be our friend. So this is exactly how you win friends, by slaughtering them. So going back to your question about Western policy making and political thinking, it's become increasingly framed by this win-win approaches. This is why I see how painful it is for Europe to get rid of this win-win framework and realize that with Russia, it has to be win-lose. There is just no other way around, because Russia, if we go back a little bit into its history and how the Soviet Russia and its political elites have been selected, it's been, after they killed the Tsar and his family, and basically either killed all aristocracy or forced them flee, what was left were just marginals and people who wanted to get power by force. And the selection throughout those 70 years of Soviet rule has been mostly negative. And what we see currently in Russia is, I'm speaking now in terms of political culture and how the political system is working. It's based on loyalty and basically still negative selection, where it is not your merits which are taken into consideration, but rather loyalty and your ability to actually commit crimes upon order of your bosses. And when we go back to Putin's biography, his descent from KGB, KGB has traditionally been, part of the criminal world, where it just depends where you draw the line, whether you are a criminal or you are representing the law enforcement or the secret services. This is to say that the West is oftentimes in denial that this is not a civilized player at the table, a statesman that would sign a treaty and follow through the commitments, but rather a criminal. And with criminal, the win-win framework means that they have shown some weakness to their opponent, that they have not been pushing their opponent hard enough to the lose situation. So for them, win-win is not a balanced solution. For them, it has to be win-lose. And when you demonstrate to them that there is no way for win-lose, they will opt for lose-lose rather than win-win. This is just how they think.
Kateryna, you've mentioned the political and military naivety of thinking about win-win instead of lose-lose. What about the economic problem, oil and food, which the West depends on, that comes from Russia, especially NATO partners?
Well, I think it still fits into the general political and ideological framework of how any resource is going to be used. And if there are political and ideological aims that are clearly opposing the Western liberal world and rules-based order, then they are going to be weaponized to undermine that order. And this is exactly what we see with Russians' economic and especially energy leverage. This has been the major miscalculation. I would diplomatically say it's a miscalculation rather than an intentional policy on the part of Germany, when they have increasingly put Europe in energy dependence from Russia. And Eastern Europe, and including Ukraine, were ringing the alarm, starting with 2014 Crimea annexation, saying that these guys are going to weaponize every leverage they have on you. And again, Germany preferred to be in denial. And there is a painful awakening right now. this Russia first policies in EU and in the West in general have also contributed to this misreading of the current situation, and basically miscalculation of what's going to happen, because everybody was so putting Russia first and Ukraine second that now many of the analysts just proven to be incompetent in predicting what's going to happen.
Kateryna, what do you think the prioritization mistake has been in the West in looking at the Russian-Ukrainian situation?
There has been traditionally this school of Soviet expertise. And I think one of the big misreadings was that everything that is Soviet equals Russian. This is something that happened with Germany when they have a guilt complex to Russians due to World War II. But for some reason, unclear to anyone, they overlook that actually 14 million Ukrainians, part of the Soviet army and of the Soviet Union, were killed during World War II. Similarly, Ukraine was second largest economy and agricultural power, but also with third largest world nuclear potential as a part of the Soviet Union. But when it collapsed, all those people who were focusing on Eurasia and so-called Slavic studies, for some reason, or were only focusing on Russia, interpreting everybody else in the Eastern Europe through Russian historical, culture, and political lenses, which has not been actually paying justice to the historical and cultural differences, especially differences in political culture that are there. And this is where it led today, when people were taken by surprise that Russian corrupt army had turned out not to be as powerful as everybody thought, and Ukrainian people resistance survived through not just first 3 days or 48 hours as majority of Western analysts predicted, but actually is standing there for 37 days already.
I want to ask you, Kateryna, to explain a phrase to the people who are watching that you have used before when I've heard you talk, that I don't think most Westerners are aware of, although the politicians are. And the phrase is Russia first. Would you just tell us what that means so we can clear that up?
So the Russia first policies have been in place since the collapse of the Soviet Union, when great powers were devising their approaches to this new reality in Eurasia and Eastern Europe, and how to deal with all these new actors. And Ukraine is a country size of France or Texas, and which means is not a little one. And was, regionally speaking, is quite a significant player, but it couldn't find its way through the Western perspective of whether there will be a positive response to its aspiration for joining European Union and joining NATO, and basically trying to build its bilateral relations with the key Western actors on its own, whereas where the West was trying to oftentimes accommodate Russians' perspectives on the region and how they should deal with Ukraine, just to be sensitive. Oftentimes it would be framed like we hear today from France, like, taking into account Russia's traumas. But eventually it turned out that this sensitivity was abused by Russia and just taken advantage of with the war in Georgia in 2008, and then a series of other wars up to Crimea annexation and war in the east of Ukraine in 2014, and further full-fledged invasion in 2022.
Kateryna, in the West, the newspapers are running wild with, the television stories are running wild with the evil kleptocrats and autocrats at the top, and the poor, isolated, unawares of the Russian masses. And we also see stories of Russian soldiers who are deserting, abandoning, even sabotaging their own equipment in the midst of all this conflict. Who are the Russian people? Do we have a bifurcated society, the kleptocrat, autocrat, and the commoner, and they're really just being dragged along by the elites? Or is everybody in Russia really in favor of this? How do you see this culture in Russia?
What the polls show today, whether we like it or not, it's the recent polling I am citing is from reputable Levada Center, is that there is 83% support for Putin's special operation in Ukraine. And the sad irony is that the support for this special operation has been growing over the past months, despite all the information leaked through the social media and all attempts to from Russians who are abroad to communicate the truth to Russians who are inside. At the same time, of course, we understand that some kind of alternative reality has been created for Russians, and this kind of information bubble where they only see what TV is showing them. And this is how I would explain the defections by Russian soldiers. First, they come and they see that the reality is not the one that they have been shown on TV, where, you know, either people are greeting them with flowers, or or people are suffering from some evil Nazis and waiting for Russian liberators. On the other hand, the resistance that a Ukrainian army is showing is really harsh and is really like intimidating to the fact that some are defecting just to save their lives.
I want to ask Professor and disciple Kateryna this question. Do you hate the Russians?
No. The emotions are very difficult. If I were to talk to someone from Russia defending this special operation right now, face to face, I should admit it would be very difficult emotionally. But I actually wish them well in a larger scale, in a bigger picture. And in that big picture, I think our interests coincide. It's a free, democratic Russia, where people, just live and invest into their own good, rather than into abusing their neighbors. And this is something that, every human being would rationally recognize as beneficial for them, just to live their own life, to build their own home. And this is something that I wish them, but I also realize that first there has to be a painful repentance process, grievances, and taking responsibility and paying the price in legal terms. And second, building up their life anew.
Kateryna, there's one question that you've raised that I don't know the answer to that you know well. And it's a short question. How Christian is Ukraine?
Well, they say there are no atheists in trenches. And yes. And yes, people are increasingly praying. In general, the opinion polls would say that up to 80% identify themselves as Christian Orthodox. But this is not something that I would just take as a starting point for this assessment, but
Sure.
rather what I see currently happening in the country, and whether there is genuine belief in place initially, or it would grow during this hardship times. But what I see is pervasive grace, because people are demonstrating some supernatural abilities that we wouldn't be able to explain where they come from if not from grace. This supernatural unity, courage, resilience, self-sacrifice, love, and also what strikes me as a political scientist is supernatural unity among political forces that were just fighting each other up until the war started. And the supernatural unity around this cause, which we all see as a just one.
Kateryna, talk to us a little bit about your personal relationship in Christ, one, how it emerged in your life, and who was important in your life to bring this understanding and grasp of Christ to you.
It's been, a journey, and God has been sending many brilliant and wonderful people to me on this journey, and it would be hard for me to identify someone in particular. But ironically, the people who have been inspiring me the most and affecting me the most were not people who were self-identifying as Christians, but they would be displaying the things that I would admire as a Christian. And among these people was my grandfather, who was a philosopher, humanist, and was actually fighting a hard ideological fight with high costs to pay during communist times to assert and affirm his belief in the value of human being against the cynicism and the communist narratives of people just being utilized in the machinery of political system. And he was the one who started the humanistic trend of philosophy in Ukraine during Soviet times. Humanistic in a good way, because he was being a non-believer, he was actually openly raising things like love, faith, hope in his philosophical works. And I had a lot of respect for him, in professional, but also in a personal way. Other people whom I really admired were some U.S. Ambassadors that I had the honor to work with, and I will not be given names, but these were people who also would not be declaring openly themselves as Christians, but I wouldn't need to ask them. I just would see how they act to understand this.
Tell me about that. I want to know what you observed, because disciples need to hear that in the West. What did you see?
Well, I see that people matter. In hierarchy of when a person is placed quite high in a professional hierarchy, taking, for example, the position of ambassador, I could still see that people are important irrespective of their place in that hierarchy, that everybody is equally respected, or merits of the people are respected, and talents are respected in a way that makes everybody around flourish, rather than serve the one person and their goals and ambitions. And so this kind of, very personal, the relational approach to people by these personalities, and also taking close to heart what they are doing, not just doing it for the sake of some formal professional duty, but really believing in what they're doing. This was also an important testimony. And if I would add more on top of that, is to not just serving the cause of their country, but also taking with responsibility and compassion interests of other people and other countries.
What led you? How did you end up in that training environment with Dennis? How did you find that? How did you end up there?
That was also a story involving politics, because the person who invited me to attend that training was Michael Ramsden, whom I met at a different conference, and just invited him to come to Ukraine and to talk to Ukrainian politicians. And I was eager to learn more from that person and from his colleagues and people who think alike. And obviously it was a great opportunity to meet many wonderful people like Dennis
and Kateryna. Yeah, thank you. And I think it's also something that Kateryna is not going to bring out unless we really dig it out of her, but she wasn't taking Michael Ramsden around just to meet a few people who were at the reception desk. She was taking Michael Ramsden into some relatively high level people in the government to help try to shape their views. Would that be fair, Kateryna?
Yes, we were meeting with decision makers. And it was encouraging to see that those conversations were also important for them and contributing to their broader picture on global politics. And of course, within the Christian value set.
Kateryna, I'm curious about the disciple Kateryna right now, what she would say to this question. If you had the ear of pastors and leaders in the Christian community in the West right now, and you were to be given a couple of minutes to say something to them so that they could begin transmitting what you've said to the believers in their Christian community, what would you want to say to them?
Well, there is a lot of discussion these days. Where is God in all these atrocities that are taking place? And what I can surely say that this is not His will, and I am very convinced that this is not His will. But we also know that He is not imposing His will by force on others. And so what's happening, the war and these terrible things associated with it is actually something that we have all collectively created grounds for, spiritually. There has to be something very wrong happening across the globe that has allowed this evil act with impunity, and we have to act against it. We are God's hands, we are God's witnesses. He is acting with, we are instruments in His actions and resistance to this evil. And this is how I see this, rather than, surrendering to the evil under the false pretext that we have to accept God's will. And this is, I think, one of the challenges faced by churches not all, but some that have difficulties in confronting Russia and basically speaking up that this evil has to be stopped. So this is something that I would share as my perspective from the person coming from the epicenter of that war. That I definitely, in war there is no life. Life stops. Everything what's happening is just, fight with death. And we know that our God is God of life. And we have to, reinstate his life and stop this parade of death, if I may say so.
And what would you say as a disciple speaking to other Christians?
I would say that each of us know where we can be of most service to the truth, justice, and love of God. I know of myself that I can be of most service in my professional area, and I am grateful that my professional area actually allows me to be of service in this situation. But there are many other ways where everybody could be of service in the way that they can be most efficient. Because obviously someone feels called to go and resist physically, others feel called to volunteer. Many can identify their own areas of resisting to the evil where they are. But my point is that if you try to turn a blind eye on this, this is definitely not a Christian strategy, in my view. The moral justification for not just providing help to refugees is that you actually, when you think of it as a system, like the ecosystem, the most fruitful way to address the issue is to actually help people rebuild their house rather than providing them shelters. And in these terms, helping Ukraine to survive as a state and resist the aggressor is, in terms of this kind of ecosystem, is much more efficient than just helping refugees sustain themselves.
And so, Kateryna, does that very ambassadorial statement also have a military edge to it?
Well, obviously, if you help Ukraine survive as a state, you help Ukraine fight the Russian aggressor.
And as a believer, would you have a concern about us saying, well, that's not the way of Jesus in the New Testament? How would you respond?
I would respond to that there is there is a legal responsibility aspect to our actions, and when Jesus, for example, forgives a criminal, if the criminal is still in prison, you would not just let them go out of prison because they are forgiven sinners. They still are serving their sentence.
Raymond, it sounds to me that one of the things Kateryna is laying on the table is how Jesus himself stood between the oppressed and the oppressor and intervened on their behalf and was not passive. What do you think?
We are supposed to be willing to give up our life to defend the innocent. So I really wanted to ask Kateryna, should we be concerned about the escalation if we actually confront Putin with significant force?
Rationally, we could say that it would be a suicide for anyone to put nuclear threat on the table. But there is nothing rational about this war. from the beginning till end. There is not even a clear end game for Putin. So we just have to admit that there is no rational framework. And irrationally, the nuclear blackmail is already there. They have been referring to nuclear capability, I think from day 2 of the war. And recently, on May 22nd, Peskov, in his interview to CNN, reiterated that nuclear capability is on the table and they may use it if Russia feels existentially threatened. The problem is that Russia, and specifically Putin, can consider himself existentially threatened in any event when he will be considering that he's losing. And because for him, losing means existentially, failing. So my question is, does this mean that we all have to be paralyzed by this blackmail and watch silently him slaughtering innocent civilians further on? My response to that would be, well, then you have to start, checking your anti-nuclear bunkers already now, because if you give up on his nuclear blackmail, he will escalate and raise the stakes up until he sees some actual resistance. So this is why I would say that you shouldn't be everyone who wants to show resistance to the bully should be actually be willing to demonstrate strength and ability to confront him. And I would also say that it is absolutely in Putin's hands to decide where is the red line for a nuclear threat to become a real option. And because he is not predictable and there is no clear rational logic behind his actions, there is no rational why we would stop here expecting him not to escalate and not expect him to go up with blackmail of nuclear power at any stage when he decides to do so. He will use nuclear intimidation at any point he decides.
In what ways would you say, in your experience and your observations, have Ukrainian disciples been well prepared to be image bearers of Christ for the days that they're in now? And in what ways not so well prepared?
Well, you see, Ukrainian, there is a saying in Ukraine that you can't read Ukrainian history without Brom. Because it's just so violent, especially the 20th century. And Ukrainians have survived the First and Second World Wars, genocide during the famine, Russian communist terror, Chernobyl. And all that was, on the fate of one people throughout 20th century. Very concentrated violence and resilience to that, which I think made Ukrainians prepared and to the self-sacrifice and unity they are displaying now, and also resilience to confront evil and to survive in such dire circumstances. But I also should say that the war itself is very brutal, and there are some challenges that the war creates when you need to overcome them in the peaceful life. I personally have experienced how the level of tolerance to brutality changes when you are experiencing war, like the language, the culture, the tolerance to violence in pictures and graphics. And it's not that we like or enjoy it, it just becomes part of life where you are no longer shocked, but you just come to terms with this new reality. And this is also losing the loved ones. It creates just anger, but it also creates hatred. And so this tolerance to violence and hatred are the challenges for the believers to overcome in the peaceful life. But otherwise, the brutality of Ukraine's history has, and basically all those brutalities I mentioned had also same source than we are facing today. Same source, same origin, the neighbor. And this is how these adverse circumstances have prepared and trained Ukrainians. And I really hope that this unity and love for each other eventually will prevail, as we definitely win eventually.
Just an overwhelming amount of information, Kateryna. It's just wonderful what you've done. So I would thank you personally, and thank you on behalf of all the people who will really benefit from your insights, from your humility, from your warm Christian love, and from your clear-headedness about how challenging the situation in Ukraine is, especially for us as Christians in whatever walk of life we are. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for spending time with us. And we're absolutely sure we want you back so we can talk to you again at greater length. Thank you for all that you do.
Thank you so much. You've been wonderful hosts with very deep, insightful questions. And I would love to come back and talk to you again. Thank you.
Folks, that's a wrap on the disciple dilemma. Right now, a disciple in war, interviewing Dr. Kateryna. And if you'll stick around as the three of us fade off the screen, you'll see the website locations that Kateryna suggests we as believers in Christ can reach out to help support. I know that several of you have asked, where do we go? Where do we look for this? So please take a look at these links that we'll have up on the screen. And for us today on the Disciple Dilemma, thanks for being with us. You can see us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, of course, and all the typical podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Amazon, Apple, and so on, as we broadcast the word. If you would subscribe to us on YouTube, if you would follow us on Facebook, you help us get leverage in the digital marketplace to get the word out that discipleship has been hacked. And we live in a very, as Kateryna showed us today, difficult, dangerous world. And we've got to engage as disciples, because ultimately the bombs aren't going to win the war. It's going to be the Lord Jesus Christ as disciples faithfully engage in not only love, but in war as we move forward. So take a look at what we're saying about this, www.discipledilemma.com. And as always, thanks for listening.